One of the things that we found in our research is that by treating the nightmares, not only did the nightmares and frequency and severity decline, sleep improves, but we also see a pretty significant impact on PTSD symptoms, like without even doing the trauma work.
Okay, everyone, today we have a great guest. We're going to be talking about treatment for nightmares, especially when those nightmares occur in the context of PTSD. And I've got a great guest. Her name is Joanne Davis. She's a professor at the University of Tulsa, and she's a clinical psychologist who specializes in nightmare treatment. And she's developed a very brief protocol with like 5 or 6 therapy sessions that helps people stop having nightmares, decrease the frequency of nightmares, and improve their sleep, which is shown to have a really massive impact on PTSD. Really excited to have her on, so let's jump in. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what you do, where you work and everything?
Sure. So I'm a professor at the University of Tulsa in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I'm a clinical psychologist. I do research on nightmares and sleep problems in people who've been exposed to some sort of a traumatic event, and I have a private practice as well.
Awesome. That's great. Okay, well, I'm so excited to dive into the topic of nightmares. This is going to be great to talk about. I think so many people struggle with this, and a lot of my audience has PTSD or at least have a past history of trauma. So could you give us like Nightmares 101? First off, what's our brain doing when it's dreaming? And then what happens when we get nightmares? Like, how do we get stuck in nightmare disorder? Can you just give us an intro to that?
Sure. So there's a number of different theories about what is happening when we're dreaming, but I think most people agree that we are processing information about what we've gone through during the day. During most of the nightmares and dreaming happens during rapid eye movement sleep. And so it's thought that the process of dreaming helps to consolidate memories. So information during the day is hooked up with longer term memories, and it's usually done on an emotional level. So if you're feeling stressed out during your day, you may dream about things that have stressed you out in the past, or they may be incorporated in your dreams in some way. And it's a way of your brain trying to make sense of things that you've gone through during the day. So when it comes to nightmares, there's a couple of different things that we think about. One is that just as during the day, your mind is trying to help you process traumatic events through introducing information to you. So through thinking about the trauma when you don't want to, having images of the trauma when you're not meaning to think about it. Those types of things that can be very disturbing when you're experiencing it is actually your mind's way of helping you to process what happened, to help you figure out why you're still distressed about what happened. So what happens though is that when these memories or these images are introduced to you, we tend to avoid. So we try to shut it down, shut it out, not think about those things. And so we end up going through kind of this dance of approach and avoidance where information is presented, it's distressing, so we try to avoid it. And that's what actually keeps post-traumatic stress symptoms going for a long time because we're just kind of stuck in this dance. Thought about the nightmares is that it is this same process that's just continuing on while we're asleep, that the mind is introducing these images and these thoughts and these emotions related to the traumatic event. Because oftentimes people who have experienced a trauma, the nightmares tend to be somewhat about the trauma. So it's never an exact replay of it, but it may be similar situations, circumstances, some of the same people maybe who are around during the traumatic event. And so one of the theories is that this is a means of helping you to try to make meaning of what happened, to try to understand at a different level the traumatic event that happened. But we get to the
nightmares or your brain trying to dream or bringing up nightmares is actually potentially your brain's attempt to process through and work through the emotions and memories of that trauma. But something gets stuck, right? Something happens stuck. Where it's not actually processing to the end where it feels better. It just keeps getting stuck and feels worse and worse.
Right. So what happens is that when we're having the nightmare, it gets to the most dysphoric point, which can be scary, but people also may feel shame or guilt instead of fear in their nightmares. And then we wake up. And so it doesn't conclude. There's no closure.
Right.
And then what happens when we wake up, people have a very hard time oftentimes falling back to sleep. They're losing a lot of sleep in this process by being woken up throughout the night and then not wanting to go back to sleep or not being able to because it's so physiologically arousing. And then the next day, we don't want to think about the nightmare. And so again, we kind of go into that avoidance. And so we don't get to the point where we can process it. And that's how we tend to get stuck.
Interesting. Yeah. So avoidance is a key feature of PTSD. It's also a key feature of anxiety. And I think my audience is very familiar with how much I talk about avoidance as being the thing that keeps anxiety going.
Yes.
Would you say that's accurate for PTSD and nightmares as well? Like avoidance is the thing that generally keeps them going, fuels them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people that I have seen over the past 25 years that I've been doing this, I may be the first person that they talk to about their nightmares. So other people may know that they have them, especially bed partners, but people don't tend to talk about the details or what actually is occurring.
So what does avoidance look like? Okay, they don't talk about it. What else? Like, how do people avoid with PTSD or with nightmares?
So it is a process of suppression, just trying to push away in some manner, thinking about it, not talking about it. With PTSD, people tend to avoid people, places, and things. So not only those internal reminders, the memories, the images that are coming up, but also those external reminders of the traumatic event as well.
Yeah, like for example, I had a client who had a traumatic experience in a room with a radiator, and then ever after that, she never wanted to be in a room with a radiator. She's trying to constantly avoid like radiators, for example. So that seems kind of paradoxical because it seems clear, like, okay, if I have a phobia of, let's say, heights, then approaching that would be like, oh, I'm going to go up staircases, I'm going to stand near balconies, I'm going to approach that, or I'm going to face my fears. How does one face their fears with nightmares? Or what? I guess we could move into the treatment aspect here. Okay, so when we look at avoidance, the antidote to avoidance is approaching, but how can you approach or face your fears with nightmares? Like, that seems really hard when it seems like they're out of your control. They happen at night or whatever.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that keeps people from seeking treatment or talking about it with somebody who may be able to be helpful or provide a referral to somebody who can be helpful, because they don't think that there's anything they can do about it. So it happens at night. It happens while we're asleep. So, what are you going to do? And people end up oftentimes like self-medicating to try to either fall asleep really quickly so they don't have to worry about having the nightmare. There's a lot of fear of sleep that gets involved with people who have frequent recurring nightmares. So they try to use substances that'll help them fall asleep really quickly or put them into deep sleep, hoping not to have any dream experiences. But yeah,
drinking alcohol, using cannabis, like sleeping medications, all that, right?
Yep, all of that. Absolutely. Yeah. And so the treatment involves, there's a number of different techniques, but there is a piece in which we have people do an exposure to the nightmare itself. So we have them write it out, start to finish, in first person, present tense, lots of details, really trying to engage the emotions that go along with the nightmares. And so that's one piece of the process in terms of, how do you approach it if it's something that's happening when you're dreaming? We do it right in the therapy session.
You do it while you're awake in therapy with some support. When you do that, that sounds really scary. I think a lot of people, with good reason, want to avoid these things that are frightening and avoid the physical sensations that come up, the anxiety, the crying, the shaking, all these things. In that session, are you doing like basically pure exposure where you're just like, we're just gonna face this, or do you also provide resources or encourage them to soothe while they're doing it?
So usually the exposure comes up in the third session. So this is typically our 5 or 6 session protocol. So the first couple of sessions prior to that, we're working on a lot of psychoeducation. So really helping people to understand why they're having the nightmares, how it's related to the traumatic event, how the experience of nightmares has then shaped the way that they think, the way that they behave related to sleep. And we start making modifications to people's sleep habits prior to that session where we're doing the exposure to the nightmares.
By that, do you mean like sleep hygiene? Like, oh, let's improve your environment. Let's make your sleep higher quality. Or you're adding in like some kind of like self-soothing next to their bed? Or what do you mean by that?
So all of that, yes.
Okay.
So we do a lot of psychoeducation about sleep habits, and then have people to identify what are some of the sleep habits that they may need to think about changing while they're in treatment. We also teach them a number of different relaxation strategies. So progressive muscle relaxation, diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing, to help them reduce that cognitive and physiological arousal that people have prior to going to sleep. Because that's another thing that we think might be going on, is if you're worried about having another nightmare, afraid of going to sleep, you're going into that experience with a lot of stress and a lot of arousal.
Like you're priming your body to be anxious in bed, and that's going to make you more likely to accelerate that cycle.
More likely to have a nightmare. Absolutely. And that's like the mood matching theory of nightmares, is that if you're going to sleep with all of this arousal and anxiety and stress and fear, then that might, when you're dreaming, your brain might be choosing things to match that emotion. And so it's going to reach for those very scary images, those very dysphoric images, to kind of match how you're feeling in that moment.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so you teach people how to have a little bit better sleep habits, how to relax a little bit before bed, how to make their bedtime a calming experience. And then by session 3, you're doing some exposure therapy. You're having them write out their nightmare in detail in first person.
Yes.
Okay. And just straight exposure, just like, let's write this down, or is it paired with anything else?
So we do the exposure, and we don't do any relaxation while they're writing it out, because we want to engage that emotion. And then we have a conversation after it. So they write it out and then they read it out loud. And then we talk about what are the themes that they might be seeing within their nightmares. Because sometimes people will have like the same 1 or 2 nightmares over and over and over again. Other people will have a lot of different nightmares, but they may have the same theme. So the themes that we talk about are the same ones that you would discuss in cognitive processing therapy. So power and control, trust, intimacy, esteem, and safety.
Okay.
So we have them think about which of those themes are coming up in their nightmares. And for most people, it's more than one theme. So they may feel like they don't have any power or control in what's happening in the nightmare, and they may feel really unsafe. So it's not just one theme. It tends to be usually a number of themes. So we have them figure out what themes are being represented, and then we shift into rewriting the narrative based on those themes. So we're going to brainstorm with people, how can you change what is happening in the nightmare to handle that theme? So if they're feeling powerless and out of control in the nightmare, then we're going to brainstorm ways that they can take agency, that they can have some power in what's happening. And then we brainstorm and we talk about, what are some possibilities? And then we have them choose a new narrative that they're going to write out, and then they do the same thing. So they write it out first person present tense, lots of details, but it's going to be a different story than the nightmare. What we've discovered along the way is that it can't be a completely new narrative. So it has to be somehow connected to the nightmare. So it's not just writing a pleasant story.
Okay. Could you give me some examples, like some anonymous client examples? Like what was like the theme of someone's nightmare, and then how did they rewrite it?
A lot of people have nightmares that involve being chased. And so I remember there was one individual who was being chased, and it was a wooded environment. And this is somebody the trauma had been interpersonal violence. So that wasn't directly represented in the nightmare, but it was her being chased through the woods. And the nightmare was about, like falling over twigs in the forest and feeling like the person or the thing that was chasing them was just about to get them. And then at some point they wake up from the nightmare.
Isn't that the case where it seems like you always wake up right before the bad thing happens?
Yep. Yeah. Right at the most intense part. Yeah.
That's what keeps nightmares going too. Anyway, okay, keep going. Okay, so she's being chased. All right.
So being chased through, yeah. And so this person initially chose to hide behind a tree and have the perpetrator or the thing that was chasing her just run right by and not notice. And so she watches the person keep running off through the woods, and she's behind a tree. And one of the things that we talked about in this session was that by hiding behind the tree, she was able to enhance her sense of safety. However, it was a very temporary sense of safety because at any point the person or the thing could have turned around and come right back. And so we talked about what are some ways that you can, one, take some more agency, because power and control was also a piece of this, but also have a more permanent sense of safety. And so she ended up writing a narrative in which it started out the same. She was running through the woods. Somebody was running behind her. She ducked behind a tree, was able to pull out her cell phone, call the police, and watched as the thing that was chasing her ran past, and she saw that there were police officers waiting at the end of the wood line, and she saw this person getting arrested. Said to her, "We've got him now, you." And so there was agency in that. She was the one who whipped out the phone and made the phone call. And there was a more sense of permanence of the safety because she saw that this person was being taken away.
When people rewrite their narrative, is it okay for them to use fantasy? And then I stood up and I pulled out my katana and I became a Thor, and they create this fantasy where they're suddenly a powerful being and kicking this thing in the teeth or something like that. Is that all acceptable? Can they go anywhere with this, or does it have to be?
They can go anywhere with it. Yeah. And we've had people who've done just really fantastical kinds of, and it can be superhero powers, or shining the bat signal into the sky and Batman, comes. There are people who choose to make it very concrete, don't want to have that fantastical component. And then a lot of people also choose humor, which is really interesting. So they choose to create something that's amusing or funny in some way. And it's really hard to hold amusement and humor and fear and anxiety at the same time. So that can be a very powerful way of approaching it. It doesn't work for everybody.
It's from Harry Potter.
It is exactly that. Yes. When I do trainings, I tell this story that I had given a talk in South Dakota many years ago, and it was all about the use of humor in doing this kind of therapeutic approach. And I had somebody come up to me afterwards, and he said, Dr. Davis, what you have here is the ridiculous treatment. And I was mortified at first. I was like, he's calling my treatment ridiculous. And he was like, no, Harry Potter.
Harry Potter.
That's the charm that they use with the Bogart.
That's right. Ridicolo or something like that.
Yeah.
Ridiculous. Yep. Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Okay. So would this be all in session 3? In the same session, they write the whole narrative normal and then they rewrite it, rescript it with a different ending? So
there are different ways of doing it. Traditionally, that's how I've done it in the past, but that takes a longer session. Usually that's about a 90-minute session, and not all clinicians and clients have that flexibility to do that. So the other way to do it would be to do the exposure and then to have the conversation about the Rescription. And then have one of the assignments be that the person, takes the week in between sessions to think about how they want to Rescript. And then you do the actual Rescription in the 4th session. Yeah. Yeah, I can see benefits to both, because I can imagine writing out that trauma story or the nightmare story could take someone to a place where they need a lot of time to re-regulate, and that would take up the rest of the session. And just talking and calming and restoring their sense of safety. But leaving them without doing the next step could mean they have this whole week where they're kind of have that hanging over them. Yeah, we definitely end the sessions doing some sort of a relaxation technique. So we do not want people to leave the session feeling really distressed, of course. So we want them to be able to sit with the distress while they're writing out the nightmare, but want to try to help them to re-regulate before they leave. One of the things that we have also noticed over the years that we've been doing this is that the act of writing it out is really powerful, and in and of itself can be very healing. Because again, this is something that people have avoided oftentimes for years and years. And so that experience of being able to face it can be incredibly, give you a sense of mastery almost. I love it. That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, so I made a video on exposure therapy last year, and I'm a climber, but I've had 4 kids in between climbing a lot, and I got really scared of lead climbing, which involves falling. And so I went to the gym, and I'd go to the gym every single week, and I'd practice falling 10 times in a row. Mm-hmm.
The first 2 or 3 falls I'd take, I was just gripped. I was just like, and by like 3 or 4, I was like, okay. And by like 5 or 6, I'm like, I'm getting a little bored of this. Like,
Yeah.
can I do something else now? But then after I would do those sessions, even though I'd fallen and I'd gotten really scared, I felt like really proud of myself. Like,
Mm-hmm.
all right, Emma, like you did something scary today. Like, good job. Way to go. So I would hope
Absolutely.
I would imagine people when they do that, they're like, I faced my fear. I wrote it down. I shared it with someone. I said it out loud. Like all of that's like empowering. That's cool. That's really cool.
Absolutely. And I remember very clearly one of the first clients that I had, she had an experience of interpersonal violence when she was a young teenager. And by the time I saw her, she was in her mid-40s. And she had been having weekly recurring nightmares since that time. So many, many, many years. And when I gave the instructions for what I wanted her to do, writing out the nightmare, and she was really nervous and anxious about doing it, but she was like, okay, here we go, and wrote it out. She wrote it out and she was crying a little bit while she was doing that. But then she sat back in her chair and she just looked at the piece of paper and she had this quizzical look on her face. And I said, hey, let me in. What's going on here? And she said, this is what I've been afraid about this whole time. Like, this is the thing that has been haunting I can handle this.
That's cool, right? Yeah,
It was so powerful.
It's so easy to run from the things that scare us, whether that's worries or the fear of abandonment or nightmares or like sensations in our body. When we sit down with it just long enough to like hold still, face it, make it external. It's like, oh, actually, I am capable. I am capable of this. It's really cool.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what else is involved with the treatment? Like how else do people, or are there other steps?
So that was session 3 and 4. So when people, after they do the Rescription, we assign them to do imagery rehearsal. So part of this treatment approach is derived from imagery rehearsal therapy that you mentioned earlier. And so they will do their bedtime routine and get into bed, and then they will think through and vividly imagine their new version, their rescripted dream. And then, so they'll do that for about 5-10 minutes, trying to imagine it in as much detail as possible. Then they'll do their progressive muscle relaxation and then fall asleep. So that's the next component. And then after that, when they come back in, usually by this time you're seeing lots of change. You're seeing lots of differences. What we tend to see is that people may still be having the nightmare, so the frequency might not be going down, but it's just not the same. So it just doesn't bother them as much, or they're seeing it more from a distance. So it's almost like watching it from afar instead of being a part of it. Or some people will talk about that the imagery is not as intense as it was before. It's more fuzzy now. So it's almost like we reduce the power of the nightmare, and then over time they just stop. They go away. And typically people don't actually. It's kind of unusual for people to actually dream the rescripted version. It's just that the original nightmare starts to go away until they're not having it anymore. Yeah.
That's really cool.
If they come back and that hasn't happened, then I would go back and say, okay, maybe we didn't get the theme right. Maybe there's something else going on that needs to be addressed, or maybe the Rescription wasn't powerful enough in some way. And so we'll brainstorm ways to kind of work with that Rescription to come up with something different. Other people have different kinds of nightmares, and so may choose to do an exposure to a different nightmare in the 4th or 5th session.
Oh, so like if they're having a nightmare about being chased, and then another time they have a nightmare about being like, I don't know, some other like being in a war situation, then you'd work through the other type of nightmare using the same process.
Yeah, typically what we find is that if you focus on the worst nightmare, and this is one of the ways in which our approach is different from what other people do, we focus on the most disturbing nightmare first. Okay. And what we have found is that if you do that, then you don't have to then address every other nightmare that they may be having. It's just they start to go away as well. So by just working on the most significant one. But
why do you think that is? Do you think the brain learns like, oh, I can process nightmares now? Like this new like sense of self-efficacy or belief in your ability to like, oh, I can handle this.
Yes.
Like, why is that? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I think there's a lot of things going on that may be contributing, but part of it is that sense of mastery. And then, because when you're having nightmares that are similar themes, like if you're having nightmares of powerlessness and being out of control, and that can play out a lot of different ways, a lot of different storylines. But if you're addressing that sense of powerlessness and being out of control, then that may generalize to other nightmare experiences within that same kind of theme. The times that we may need to go and work on a different nightmare is if they're also having nightmares that include different kinds of themes.
Okay.
So if they are having power and control nightmares, but they're also having like trust and intimacy nightmares, then we might need to do work on both.
Interesting. Do these 5 themes show up generally just in nightmares, or is this like a theme related to fear that's universal? These 5 themes.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So the themes come from the idea that those are the areas that trauma is going to impact you in. Yeah. And that's how Patty Resick developed cognitive processing therapy, that those were the ways in which trauma was going to change the way that you thought about things, the way you felt about things, and how you behaved because of those 5 themes. So it made sense when I was putting this together that would also be showing up in people's nightmares.
Yeah. Could we walk through like examples of the themes? Tell me the 5 themes again, and then give me an example of like the first one and how that might show up in a nightmare, and then what someone might rescript.
Sure. Okay. So the first one is power and control. And so this is feeling like you don't have any agency, like things that are going around you, you don't have any say in it, basically. And during the day, this can look like people who either try to control everything. So they,
Like micromanaging.
Work very hard to micromanage. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Perfectionism.
They do the opposite where they're like, I don't have any control. And so they're very indecisive.
Like, why bother?
Why bother? Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so in nightmares, this can come up in so many different ways, just things happening around you that you don't have any control over. It could be somebody who's in a combat situation and they've been trained how to fight. They know how to use a gun, but in their nightmare, nothing's working. Like they can't fire their weapon. Like they don't, like all of their actions just aren't leading to what they know should happen. And so they feel like, they don't have any power in that situation. And so they can rescript that by being able to talk themselves through, this is what I do next. And then this is what I do next. And this is what I do next. That they can even like change the kind of weapon that they have, or maybe they don't even have a weapon. It's actually one of those guns that shoots bubbles instead of bullets, so they can change a lot of different aspects of it.
Okay.
The next one is safety.
Interesting. Okay.
So people feeling unsafe in a situation. And during daytime hours, this can look like hypervigilance, like always looking over your shoulder, feeling like you're unsafe, feeling like somebody is always out to get you kind of thing. And shows up in nightmares in that bad things are happening, that you are about to be injured in some way. And so people generally resolve that. Usually that's tied with power and control. So they usually resolve the safety issue by doing something, taking some action, or bringing other people into the situation to help them out. I had somebody who was having a nightmare about being brought to this location, and there were other people there who intended her harm and started to physically assault her. And so she felt very unsafe, very out of control. There's nothing that she could do in that situation. And then when she rewrote it, she ended up somehow, she like yelled out during the assault, and her father came through the front door, and the 2 of them together beat up the people who were assaulting her.
Excellent. Yeah. Love it.
The next one would be trust. So this is feeling like you can't depend on other people. And we see this sometimes in people who've experienced like interpersonal violence or combat. And so the nightmare may be that, you have a plan for how you were supposed to engage in a certain operation, but nobody else is doing their job. And so you feel like you're stuck, and now you're in more danger because nobody else is doing what they're supposed to do. Or you're in a bad situation and you're looking around trying to catch people's eyes or get other people to pay attention and help you out, and nobody does. So when we rewrite it, a nightmare like that, it would be imagining or rescripting it so that there are people there who you can trust and you can say, hey, I need help here. And they come in and help you out. And then there's esteem. So that usually has to deal with bad feelings about yourself in some way. Like I should have done.
This isn't like the classic naked dream. This is something else.
Usually something else. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Keep going.
So yeah, feeling like I should have done something different.
Okay.
Whatever's happening is in some way my fault. So we tend to see this with people who have experienced loss as a part of their trauma and feel like maybe they didn't do enough. Somebody who lost a buddy in comrade or lost a comrade in combat. Or, somebody who experiences some other kind of traumatic loss. And typically, when it comes to nightmares about loss, it is very unusual for somebody to rewrite it to bring that person back to life, like in a permanent way. Usually I've seen people rescript those nightmares by having a conversation with the person that they didn't get to have before they left.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
And this can be like, I've seen people write, like, as a person is dying in combat, them being able to say, hey, I got you, and I'm going to take care of your family. Like, I'm going to leave here and I'm going to go take care of your family. You're okay. You can go now. Or parents who have lost kids, like opening up a portal and being able to have a conversation with their child. Very intense. Very intense.
Tender, yeah. Really tender.
And then the last one is about intimacy. And these are in some ways related to trust in that there's not a sense that the people that you expect to be there for you and around you are there. So I'm trying to think of a good example. Nothing's coming to me right now.
That's okay. We can come back to it too. Yeah. Well, I think with trauma, it's always great to do it in the company of someone else because there's a lot of shame involved with trauma and like shame dies in the sunlight, right? Like we have to connect. Connecting with a human is part of healing.
Absolutely.
You can't just ignore that aspect of it.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's great. Any treatments for night terrors? So I've been researching night terrors and they happen usually in a different wave, a different stage of sleep. They usually happen in like light sleep moving into deeper sleep, right?
So they happen in stage 3 sleep.
Stage 3.
That's where most of the parasomnias happen.
And usually they aren't related to PTSD, but I was learning that sometimes they can be. They sometimes can be related to PTSD.
Yeah, I think so. The parasomnias tend to go hand in hand a lot of times, and there seems to be some genetic family links to people who experience parasomnias. The best treatment that I'm aware of for sleep terrors is actually scheduled awakening.
Yeah.
Yeah, so people typically have them around the same time each night. I think it's usually like the first slow wave sleep episode that they'll go into. And so if you can wake somebody up about 15, 20 minutes prior to that time, then they tend to then go back to sleep and sleep through and not have them.
So interesting. Are there any genetic predispositions for nightmares or sleep conditions that predispose nightmares, like sleep apnea or other like wakening things?
So some of the sleep disorders do seem to have some possible genetic links to it. And I know with obstructive sleep apnea, it's comorbid with insomnia. It can be comorbid with nightmares, pretty high frequency of those two things together. And part of that may be that sense of not being able to breathe and choking may actually trigger nightmare experiences. So I know that when you treat sleep apnea, the nightmare frequency tends to go down, like doesn't usually get rid of them. And it's not like the cure for nightmares, but it can be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting.
I love doing the nightmare approach and the sleep in general, like treating sleep issues, because they tend to be so much briefer and you see success quickly. Yeah. I've really enjoyed that.
Too. I love what you're describing too, because it's like, 5 or 6 sessions where it's like, I think a lot of general therapists like myself, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I didn't go through psychology training. And a lot of therapists with a master's degree have never been taught like some of these CBT skills that make treatment very short. Yes. So they might do talk therapy for 2 years about what's fueling your nightmares. And it's like, come on, like you just don't know like the actual treatment that is more effective and more rapid. And that makes therapy more accessible too.
Yeah. One of the things that we found in our research is that by treating the nightmares, not only do the nightmares and frequency and severity decline, sleep improves, but we also see a pretty significant impact on PTSD symptoms, like without even doing the trauma work. And so, when I do trainings with clinicians, I talk about, if somebody has nightmares as a part of PTSD, but it doesn't seem to be like the main driver of the distress, then probably treating the PTSD first and then seeing what happens. But if it's the nightmares that are really seem to be, one of the most significant things and really kind of fueling everything, then start with the nightmares, and then see if, you even need to do the PTSD treatment afterwards. I think most people probably would, but yeah, it's something to think.
Still very impactful. And you think about why, and it's like, well, one, we're helping the brain process these memories. So if the brain can process these memories at night, it's going to start chipping away at this old backlog of memories, right? And you're going to develop that feeling of confidence, like, oh, I can process these feelings. But we're also improving sleep, and sleep is one of the most impactful measures of mental health, right? Like if you sleep good, you're much better at managing the triggers that show up during the day, or working through your emotions and not overreacting, doing stupid stuff that makes you feel worse later. So that's cool. I think
it gives you the more, you've got then the cognitive and the emotional resources, when you're sleeping better to then, deal with the other stuff that's going on.
Hey, if you found any part of this video helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up or comment below what you found was helpful. Also, if you can think of someone who might benefit from this video, if you could share it, that'll help them. But all of these things help tell the algorithm that this content is helpful for people, and then they'll show it to more people who it can help. So really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here. Take care.